So, and I tried to say that earlier, you know. I'm quite willing to say, it seems obvious to me, it seems entirely non-controversial to say, we'd be a lot better off if that person were not around. I mean, I hope I don't sound mean, but I could create a pretty long list of people who, if they were not among us, we'd all be better off. I wouldn't mind reading in the paper today that so-and-so passed away in his sleep, you know. I go, that's kind of a good thing, you know, wouldn't bother me. But to start talking about, well, what that person deserves, right, that's a whole other thing. And I, you know, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line between who deserves what and why? And it becomes, to me, it becomes utterly arbitrary. We try not to make it arbitrary. We come up with rules, and we come up with principles, and we come up with, you know, agreements. And I think all those rules and principles and agreements are a kind of facade. And they're a facade that papers over the utter arbitrariness of doing that.
You mentioned that nonviolence works as itself in movements and struggles and these sorts of things. Do you think the position just becomes untenable if you're not actually engaged in those activities? I mean, essentially it's, okay, well, this is a lifestyle choice for me, I'm choosing nonviolence, so I do X, Y, and Z. As opposed to actually trying to struggle to change institutions, you know, that, for instance, capitalism or all system of violence.
Well, that's a difficult question for me, if I understood your question correctly, because on one hand, I think everybody should be up to their eyeballs, like many of you are, and like I have been, you know, in much of my life, and maybe still am, just trying to make the world better, in all kinds of ways, on all kinds of fronts, in structural, systematic, deep, meaningful, institutional ways. You know, and on one level, I just want to say everybody needs to be doing that as much as they can. And if you're not, you're a poser. You're a liar. You know, you're on the wrong side. On the other hand, you know, for God's sake, you know, we all need to just enjoy life a bit. And you know, there are people who just make beautiful music and that's all they do, and I'm glad they do that. You know, I'm glad that their music enriches my world, and they're not, you know, they're not on the front lines of anything. They're just making music or good food or whatever. And I think, you know, or they, you know, and I think there's something to that too. So I think there's an actual kind of dilemma and dialectic and a kind of searching for the right kind of balance that we all need to do. And at one level, we need to be up to here in it, and in another way we don't. And I think people who claim to be pacifists, I believe, have an extra obligation, as it were, a kind of extra duty to be up to here in trying to change the world nonviolently. Because there's one thing about violence, there's no symmetry between violence and nonviolence. There's no, you know, it takes thousands and thousands and thousands of people acting courageously in concert with one another to do the good that would offset the horrendous evil one person could do violently if, you know, he has access to the levers of power that he can set in motion certain events. I mean, there's a kind of power to violence in its destructiveness that takes a few, whereas there's a necessity for the power of nonviolence to be made manifest and institutionalized by the many. And so there's a kind of built-in profound advantage to those who would use violence. And so I think that when people employ violence, usually, this is very easy to see in the case of the United States, you know, when we send troops off to Iraq or Afghanistan or Grenada or Honduras or, you know, you name it, that's the easy thing to do. There's nothing courageous about that. There's nothing costly about that. That's just the easiest thing to do. We can be slackers and be lazy and be stupid and be selfish and, you know, year after year, decade after decade, and then send the troops somewhere, you know. Whereas if you don't believe in sending the troops somewhere, you have to relentlessly work all the time to bring about the good you want to bring about. Because you don't have, as a tool in your toolkit, sending the troops somewhere. Josh, and then you.
Yeah, like the kind of main thing I would like to talk about is, so I mean, you know, we're talking about violence, and I think it seems like we're talking about it in a strictly hypothetical sense, because I mean, we live in the United States, and you know, I can't really think of any progressive, activist groups in the United States that are actually using violence. You know, at this point, we're basically all of us are in the non-violent stage. But there is violence happening in the world today, and there's progressive violence happening in the world today, and it's usually in the third world countries where they are resisting the violence of the United States. You know, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, or you know, people who are fighting against death squads and things like that. The U.S. has set up as puppet governments and things like that. So it just kind of seems to me like a little bit hypocritical to universally reject violence while living in a country which is reaping the benefits of this horrendous, massive violence that is occurring worldwide. And so I wonder what, well actually I can read a quote from Franz Fanon, that I'd just like to hear what your response to this would be. Oh, it's actually by Jean-Paul Sartre. And he says, the pacifists are a fine sight, neither victims nor torturers. Come now, if you are not a victim when the government you voted for and the army your young brothers served in commits genocide without hesitation or remorse, then you are undoubtedly a torturer. And if you choose to be a victim, risking 1 or 2 days in prison, you are simply trying to take the easy way out. But you can't. There is no way out. Get this into your head. If violence were only a thing of the future, if exploitation and oppression never existed on Earth, perhaps displays of nonviolence might relieve the conflict. But if the entire regime, even your nonviolent thoughts, is governed by a 1,000-year-old oppression, your passiveness serves no other purpose but to put you on the side of the oppressors. So basically, my question is how should pacifists living in the United States deal with either with support or non-support of the violent resistance to American imperialism?
Okay. Well, that quote is a great one, and it raises a lot of issues, but I'll try to be very quick. I do agree that I have a problem of complicity. And I submit everyone in this room has the same problem. For example, I'm not the only one living in the United States. So, should we pay taxes? You know, there are good reasons not to pay taxes. Should we live in the United States? There are good reasons not to live in the United States, whether we're pacifists or not. I think the idea that a pacifist has some obligation to, I don't know, not live in the United States or fight American imperialism or some way that the non-pacifist doesn't have, that strikes me as odd. And if you, by the way, since you used the word hypocritical, let me counterpose this question. I don't believe that people ought to kill other people, and therefore I'm not killing other people. Some of you believe we should kill other people. So the question to you is, why aren't you doing it?